Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the CatsHQ Podcast, the first spring/summer episode since the end of the basketball tournament. I am John Hale, sitting alongside Fletcher Page, the other half of the CJ's UK beat writing team. We survived March Madness. We're recording this on Monday of the national championship game. Obviously, Kentucky is not in Phoenix. We are not in Phoenix. We are back in the home offices in Lexington. Fletcher was at McDonald's last week in Chicago to look at the next group of Kentucky basketball players. I've been back at spring football for the last week, covering a little baseball. So we'll touch on all those things in this week. But let's start off with NBA draft, which is basically what we focused on for the whole thing. Any sort of updates or reads on what you think people are doing right now and where they're going?
I'm a little bit surprised that we don't already know about Malik and De'Aaron. Those two seem to be locks. But again, and we went over this pretty extensively, there's a couple of guys for UK that have got some decisions to make, some surprising decisions, I think. And I think it's going to be a tremendous amount of turnover for the roster in this offseason.
Yeah, Fletcher's got a draft tracker up on the website you can check out. You can bookmark that to see where each of the guys is at. Pretty much everybody on the roster has a decision, and we broke those guys down player by player last week. So if you haven't listened to that episode, I encourage you to go back and do that, the season wrap-up episode. But regardless of who leaves, we know some of the people who are coming, and you were in Chicago last week to get a close look on three of those guys, right? Four of those guys at the McDonald's All-American game. I know you didn't get in this job early enough to see those guys in the AAU circuit, so that was really maybe your first exposure to a lot of them. What just were your takeaways from watching those guys practice?
Yeah, from the four commits or signees, I thought Quade Green was the most vocal player of anybody there. Really impressive the way that he kind of engaged with everybody, not just his future teammates, but everybody that was practicing. So that stood out. And I thought Jared Vanderbilt was a little bit of a surprise to me. He created, hit some jump shots. So he had a really good practice while we were out there. Nick Richards, I made this comment to somebody I was sitting with. I can't believe the players these days. Nick Richards at almost 7 feet tall. He's dribbling like a guard, shoots three-pointers, really fluid. He's got a ways to go, though, in terms of physicality maybe, and also maybe figuring out what his niche is. I mean, he's got so many strengths that sometimes maybe that's a weakness, because he plays inside, outside, and also I thought P.J. Washington was a very cerebral player. He had an ankle injury during the practice pretty much right as it started, so I didn't get to see him play that much, but I did get to talk to him. But yeah, it was pretty interesting to see those four guys sort of mix on the court and off. And then I think the storyline most people wanted to know about, Kevin Knox, Mohamed Bamba. If Kentucky could add those two, it would just be an incredibly – it already is an athletic class. And if you watch these guys, again, like I said, Mohamed Bamba is very similar to Nick Richards in that he's almost 7 feet tall. Plays like a guard sometimes, though. So Kevin Knox, another guy, 6'8", really versatile. So much versatility, and I think it's just sort of a product of how kids are playing these days, how they're developing. So to see those four Kentucky kids, recruits, how they were engaging, interacting, and actively recruiting Mohamed Bamba and Kevin Knox, I think was certainly the storyline for Kentucky fans to track up there.
Yeah, I know there was some excitement going on with those guys, some cookies maybe that were being made that you wrote about. Any sort of feel for those two guys after talking to them a little bit and the other Kentucky guys?
Yeah, the cookies, that was a nice little creative thing. Quade Green had put a BBN on some cookies, slid it into like some camera shots, so that way it would be sort of add to the sort of the speculation now with those recruitments sort of dragging on. I think, though, that for me, again, when I'm talking about this, when you watch these kids play, again, 7 feet tall almost, and they all sort of look the same in terms of how they play. So I asked P.J. Washington, how is this going to work if you have P.J. Washington, Jared Vanderbilt at 6'8", Kevin Knox, Mohamed Bamba, Nick Richards. You got all these sort of and maybe ambiguous players that could play 3, 4, 5. And he said, I don't know how we would make it work in terms of rotation or who's playing when, but he said, I know we'd block a lot of shots and we would be really athletic. So that was probably what I spent the most time talking to those kids about. Is okay, you're trying to assemble this. What would you do if it happened? And so it's pretty interesting listening to them give that take.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest question about this class is what they're going to do on the perimeter. Obviously, Quade Green's going to play the point, assuming Isaiah Briscoe doesn't come back. Hamidou Diallo, if he elects to return, like most people seem to think he will, it's going to be a two-guard there who's maybe not the best shooter in the world. Then that 3 spot, the 4-2 with all those different guys. They seem so interchangeable, but whether any of them can shoot enough to stretch the court in the way that Derek Willis did this year, or Michael Mulder, or Malik Monk, obviously. Did you see anything in these practices that made you think that shooting's not going to be a serious issue for them next year?
I really did not. I just saw South Carolina's women's team. They won the national championship without hitting a 3-point shot. I don't know if that would work for Kentucky, but I thought that Jared Vanderbilt did shoot better than what I've been told, and I've been told that he was hurt last summer a lot, didn't really get to, and he was hurt during the season too. So he was kind of a surprise to everybody just because nobody knew what to expect. He was hitting step back jumpers and looked really good. So he was a better shooter than I thought. And then Quade Green told me that he could shoot. And I don't know if you've seen the story that I wrote. He said that he was going to be the most consistent shooter that Cal's ever had. Quade does not lack for confidence, which I think is what they need going into this season. But I would not predict that they would be a good shooting team, even though, like I said, your center recruit is Nick Richards, and that kid he's got a great looking shot. It doesn't always go in at this point. So the potential is there, but I would not feel confident saying it'll be a good shooting team next season.
It'll be interesting to see how Cal uses Richards, because so many of his big guys, when they've got here, have loved that face-up shot, whether it's Karl Towns or Scalabissiere, even Anthony Davis to a little bit. And he's always emphasized, go inside first. Mm-hmm. We're going to get you to where you're a strong post player with your back to the basket, and then we'll work out from there. And then we see those guys go to the NBA at the next level and shoot it way more than they ever did at Kentucky. And Cal makes that joke all the time where they say, you held me back. If you let me shoot it this much, we'd have been really good. And we saw a little bit of that in the North Carolina game with Isaac Humphries when he was hitting those face-up jumpers. And he really had not had the opportunity to do that all season. So I wonder if Humphries comes back, doesn't transfer or go pro in Australia. I think those are his two options right now. Will they use him that way? And with him playing so well against North Carolina, and maybe use some of these other guys. Mm-hmm. You look at Scal in the NBA, who has just blossomed in Sacramento since they traded DeMarcus Cousins, playing away that Cal didn't really have him play except in a stretch at the end of the year. So I wonder if his thinking on that has evolved at all, or if we're going to see him try and force these guys into post players again.
I think his thinking is going to have to evolve, because I think that there's not really going to be a choice with some of these players. Now Richards is a guy, he hasn't been playing basketball that long personally, only a couple years. I don't see him in many mock drafts for the 2018 class. So I could see him being a guy that kind of gets in, either blows up and skyrockets up to the mock drafts, or maybe it takes him a little bit more time to kind of figure out. Like I said, he's got so many things that he could be good at, but you end up kind of knocking that, because now you're saying, well, what is it exactly that he is great at? And he's going to take some time to figure that out.
And that's not even factoring in Wenyen Gabriel, who is a very similar player stylistically to those guys too, in terms of a big, tall guy who is athletic, and you would hope if he comes back, spends an off season in this weight room, gains some weight, gets stronger. But he at times this year looked like a decent shooter and might be their second or third best shooter next year. You'd think he'd need to play on the perimeter too, and how he mixes and matches all those guys is going to be really interesting. Obviously, Shai Alexander was not at the McDonald's game. He'll be at the Derby Festival in a couple of weeks, right? So I think you'll maybe get a chance to see him there. But him, if they add Kevin Knox, if they add another guard, we're starting to hear some names of some 4-star, 3-star kind of guys that are out there. How these guys factor in, it seems like that backcourt right now is a real question still.
Certainly. I do think, though, that you have sort of what you're looking for mentally, or maybe in terms of leadership, as good as you could have in terms of freshman players. I don't think Diallo might be as vocal, maybe, but he certainly has jump-started his progression, being around for a semester. I think that he is what Cal uses that calls an alpha dog, and maybe he overuses that term, and maybe we do too now. I think that's what Diallo is. I think he's very strong mentally, and I think Quade Green is vocally what they need. But they need some. What I really liked about this past year's perimeter was it was so diverse. You had two seniors in Hawkins and Mulder. One was a defensive stopper, one was a three-point shooter. Isaiah Briscoe sort of, took care of the little details and sort of had that edge to him. And then obviously Monk and Fox were very drastically different players too. I'm not seeing a lot of diversity right now on this perimeter for Kentucky next season. And that becomes an issue, like as you've seen covering this team for so long. You run into games where you need shooters, or you run into games where you've got to have a defensive spark, or you got to be different. And as of right now, I don't see that much diversity.
Yeah, it's interesting among that group of current kind of backcourt players. Obviously, it would probably help them if Briscoe comes back just from a leadership standpoint and taking over the team, although it seems like from what you wrote today on Monday on the website and what we've heard about Hamidou Diallo over the last semester, Diallo and Green are taking on that leadership role, and it's going to be their team. So maybe Briscoe coming back complicates that a little bit. But among those guys who are leaving, it's almost like Michael Mulder is the one that would be most helpful next year because of his shooting, and they need a role player off the bench. I don't know if there's a guy out there. We've started to see, I guess the new name is Mark Smith, Mr. Illinois basketball, who has kind of blown up on the ratings recently. He's a 4-star kid from Illinois. He's getting a bunch of big Power 5 offers in the last month or two. Kentucky has reportedly made interest. He might visit campus. You covered Illinois for a while, so you know that state at least. Even if you haven't seen him play, what kind of player do you expect maybe that this might be?
Well, he's one of those kids that he's close to St. Louis, closer to St. Louis than Chicago. And you would expect that to be a Missouri-Illinois battle, especially considering those two programs just brought in new head coaches. It's perfect. It's in the wheelhouse of that area in those two schools. And so I'm sure that they're cringing now. It's almost like you've got this sort of a sleeper or a hidden gem. You really like your chances if you're Illinois or Missouri. Now you're hearing Kenny Payne's reached out. Okay, that's trouble. So it's a player. What I like about Mark Smith, just from what I've seen on paper, and I have not reached out, and I will start maybe trying to dig in a little bit there, is he's 6'5". He's, 225 maybe. Bigger body player, and he shoots pretty well from three. So that would be what you're looking for in terms of physicality, and then also they need a skilled shooter desperately. And you've written extensively about Cal not wanting to take graduate transfers. If they ever were going to, this would be the year. But if they can get in on maybe a kid, doesn't have to be top 100. Actually, I think it might be beneficial if he's not. Get a player they can get in, have for a couple seasons, develop as a shooter. I think that would round out, which to me is already an incredible class. It's going to be fun to watch how they assemble this whole thing. But that would be sort of the icing on the cake.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up the graduate transfer thing. And obviously, twice during the tournament, back-to-back weekends, John Calipari came out and said he did not like the graduate transfer rule. It hurts mid-majors, so on and so forth. And really was so adamant against that rule that it seems almost impossible that he would go out there and take one. That being said, this week, Cameron Johnson from Pitt became available.
He looks perfect.
He's a redshirt sophomore guard from John Calipari's hometown. He shoots 40% from three. Maybe Cal could get around his sort of adamant non-graduate transfer thing recently because it's not a mid-major he'd be coming from. It's a situation where obviously the coach that recruited him left and is no longer there. John Calipari and Kevin Stallings have a nice little rivalry among their own, so it might be a nice jab at Kevin Stallings. So I think if Cal wanted to, he could make this work and go out and justify it however he needed to, and he'd probably take a hit nationally, but UK fans wouldn't care. I mean, if they got a 6'8" guard who could shoot from three and be a piece for 2 years, not even just 1 year, that would be really big for them. We have not heard any sort of firm connections with this kid yet, but he seems like the perfect candidate, especially being from Moon Township, where Calipari's from in the Pittsburgh area. Yeah,
and real quick, he played in a great conference. A lot of times you have to worry about, maybe the jump up in competition. There's numerous reasons why you wouldn't want to go down this route. This one seems to check out, though, more than some of the others.
So we talked about the two guys who maybe guards. There are a couple other names out there, some 4-star, 3-star kids that we'll probably hear more about in the coming weeks as we get a better idea of which of these remaining All-Americans come to Kentucky, if Kevin Knox is supposed to visit Missouri now, I guess, where Michael Porter obviously is the best player in the class. So that's the SEC is getting better. That might affect Kentucky's chances. I think most people have them as the favorite for Bamba now. That would probably not affect what happens in the guard spots on the team. Might affect whether or not Bam Adebayo comes back, which I think both of us think is not going to happen. Any sort of other storylines to watch as they kind of close out this 2017 class over the next couple of months?
I've been working with the number 8 in mind in terms of high school players they bring in, but you will run into a situation where, and I guess it doesn't matter. I guess class doesn't really matter if they're going to lose as many players as they could anyway after this season. But bringing in a grad transfer who has multiple years to play would help with maybe some separation. And also, I will say about this class, the one and done stuff we talk about that a lot, and we have to hear about that a lot. A kid like Quade Green, though, I don't like to make comparisons, but he's 6'1". He has kind of a Tyler Ulis aspect to where I anticipate he'll be around at least 2 seasons. Jared Vanderbilt does not have the look of a one and done. Nick Richards is far from a finished product. So I think this class, more than the last one especially, but most of Cal's classes, I think it's more balanced, and I think you're going to see more of these kids hang around, especially considering that there may not be very many holdovers from this past year's team on hanging around. So I think you might have an identity that's developed. Maybe it's Quade Green, and you're going to see that identity stick around for a season or two.
Alexander, obviously another guy
same way.
Who's almost assuredly you would think was not going to be a one and done. It'll be interesting to see what they do with those guys, because you think back to some of Calipari's class, that 2013 class, which came in and had 2 one and done players in Nerlens Noel, who obviously got hurt, and Archie Goodwin, who you can argue whether or not that was a smart decision for him to be a one and done guy. But they had players in that group. It was Kyle Wiltshire, he was a year before that, but Willie Cauley-Stein, who was a 3-year player who developed into a lottery pick. I think this might be a group where we see some of that again, where these guys are still going to be top picks down the road. It just may not be immediately next year.
Certainly, yeah. I mean, there's something to be said for Malik Monk and De'Aaron Fox. They were projected as top 10 picks this time last year. They went out and they fulfilled their potential, and that's fun to see. That's fun to see a player come in as being billed as a top guy and either hit that mark or do better. But I think that there's a lot of wild cards in this class, and I say that in a good way.
Yeah, just for reference's sake, looking at Draft Express's 2018 mock draft right now. So these would be guys who are going to be freshmen next year. They have Mohamed Bamba, number 4. So obviously, if Kentucky gets him, he's a one and done guy from almost certainly. Moving down the list here, Kevin Knox, number 12. So if they got him, and maybe Kentucky's not the favorite there right now, he would be a guy who will be here 1 year. But among the guys that Kentucky already has committed, going down the list here, I don't.
That's it.
That's it. Yeah, there's nobody in the top 30 in the first round in Draft Express 2018 right now who would be gone. So it'll be interesting to see if they have any one and dones from that group. Surely they'd have one. I mean Bamba if they get him, but Calipari's never, as far as I can remember, he's had at least multiple one and done players every year. So it'll be interesting to see how he handles that sort of roster management and what's going on there. He doesn't have any real veterans on the roster next year. Right. If Isaac Humphries comes back, he would be a junior, which seems to be a major question right now. Ty Wynyard, who you wrote about this week that Cal said on his radio show, Ty had gotten much better and had already met with him too. If he came back, he'd be a sophomore who's barely played, but he is a year and a half of time on the roster. Wyndon Gabriel, who you would think if he comes back would probably leave after next season, but it's going to be really top heavy in that freshman class specifically. And then that next year, you would think they'd have a bunch of veteran guys, which is always kind of the setup for Cal's best teams.
Right. And I know we're always talking about games and stats and what's going on the court, but I think Ty Wynyard would be he would be really important to the development of some of these kids. Like I said, we're talking about 7-footers that are lurking on the perimeter. I think one of the best things that could happen to a Nick Richards would be to have to guard Ty Wynyard, who's as physical as the son of a lumberjack can be. So I think it's important for him to hang around in terms of development of others, not just himself.
And just a quick word before we transition to spring football. Obviously, Kentucky is always going to carry the bell for the SEC in terms of basketball recruiting. But a bunch of these other teams have really kind of stepped up this year, and we've seen that over the last couple of years trending this way. But especially with Michael Porter committing to Missouri now with the coaching change there. I know you tweeted and wrote about this a little bit in Chicago. It seems like there's kind of a nice SEC rivalry already burgeoning among these players. Seeing South Carolina make it to the Final Four is only going to help the way the league performed in the tournament overall with the 5 teams that got in. It seems like this league is heading in a positive direction finally.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite players to watch during the practice at McDonald's All-American game was Colin Sexton, who's the point guard from Georgia going to Alabama. and very explosive, athletic. Didn't remind me of, like I said, I hate comparisons. It's kind of like very like De'Aaron Fox maybe in terms of mentality, getting to the rim. So I think Alabama has certainly raised their level of recruiting, and Missouri clearly has too now already. And I think that the SEC is, dare I say, on the rise.
So with that, SEC basketball, let's transition to the thing that people actually care about in the SEC, maybe outside of Lexington as much, spring football, which I imagine in South Carolina and Columbia this week, they've had some interesting kind of conversations about how to deal with this Final Four team with spring football going on, and a baseball team, which is probably the second most popular sport at South Carolina, all things considered, a women's basketball team that won the national championship. So that's been interesting times. But for us here in Lexington, Mark Stoops and company are now halfway through spring practice. Practice 9, I think, was Saturday, so they've got 2 weeks left. The spring game is April 14th on a Friday night, Good Friday, which is an interesting scheduling decision for Kentucky, but we'll save that for another time. So far, coming back, getting kind of in the fold with spring football again after the basketball tournament. Not a ton that you probably missed that would turn heads. We've heard about a couple minor position changes, whether it's Devontae Robinson moving from corner to safety. Dakota Holtzclaw moved to tight end briefly and then quit the team apparently. So there are now 85 scholarships for the fall. That's probably the biggest piece of news. We heard Saturday, the second scrimmage of spring, Drew Barker was back for a series. I think he played close to 10 plays for them, led the offense to a touchdown. But Eddie Gran, the offensive coordinator, did say that it was a very limited playbook. They specifically designed the game plan so he wasn't going to have to throw it down the field 2 or 3 times in a row as he rehabs from this back injury. So really, I think the big news from spring football so far is nothing major has happened either way to change what the outlook for this team in the fall is. We went into spring thinking Steven Johnson was definitely going to be the starting quarterback, and now 2.5, 3 weeks into it, more than halfway through practice, there is absolutely no scenario under my mind where a healthy Steven Johnson is not the starter for Southern Miss in the fall.
See, that's what I wanted to ask you about, and maybe I'm a little bit hypocritical in this. I thought the best thing for maybe a Hamidou Diallo or the best thing for Malik Monk was those two players going at each other in practice. So I am a big proponent of competition. But for some reason, there's something that makes me nervous when you've got that same scenario at quarterback. And so with Barker coming back, and if he's healthy, do you see that as a positive environment where you've got two guys that started last season, two guys that I assume have two guys that have had a lot of success in their careers? I mean, do you find that to be advantageous, or is there a reason why I'm always skeptical of two good quarterbacks?
No, I think that's I think that's a big concern. I mean, I think if you're a coaching staff and it works out perfectly, obviously you want to have two guys because, I mean, Steven Johnson told us the other day he's eating like 5,000 calories a day in hopes of getting to 195 pounds before the fall. If only we were all that lucky. But, I mean, a guy playing at that frame in the SEC is an injury risk at any moment. It takes one hit and you're out without your starting quarterback. And then it'd be nice to have a guy who can come in who started games, who was a 4-star recruit out of high school that you feel comfortable with. They did say this week, Darren Henshaw, the quarterback's coach, that Gunnar Hoke, the redshirt freshman, who is basically the second-team quarterback this spring as they work Barker in certain situations, they're confident they could win SEC games with Gunnar Hoke at quarterback. I think that might be putting the cart before the horse a little bit right now. That seems a little premature. But with two guys, obviously Drew Barker beat Steven Johnson for the job in camp last year. So he was a guy who won the job, and apparently it was not terribly close. I think it was pretty clear to everybody who watched that team play in the summer and fall heading up to the season that Drew was the better player. And then we saw that in the first half against Southern Miss in the opener where they threw it so much. He had close to 300 yards passing in the first half. Obviously, they blew the big lead in the second half and lost. Got embarrassed at Florida the next week. And from there, it hasn't really gone so well. And Steven came in. They vastly had to change the offense and how it worked. Basically ran a completely different system. And, win, 7-8 games down the stretch, which is really impressive for them. And I think just watching this team, especially when we were in Jacksonville for the Tax Slayer Bowl the week beforehand, getting to go to some of those events with the players that led up to the game, it completely seemed like Steven Johnson's team to me. I mean, he was the one guy when we were at Topgolf who was floating from group to group. All the guys kind of, naturally cordon off into the running backs and the defensive backs and the guys from Ohio and the guys from Florida or whatever. and kind of stuck in their little groups. But Steven was the one guy who was bouncing from group to group and really seemed to be involved everywhere. And it completely seemed like his team, and we've heard that from players throughout the summer leading up to the bowl game. We've heard it again this spring. So I would think in the locker room right now, just the view I get from the outside, all those guys, I would guess, are pretty firmly in the Steven Johnson camp, especially with the way they played with him at quarterback last year. So I don't think there's much risk in terms of a divide as to who the players think should start. But if Barker comes back fully healthy and looks good again, you got to wonder what his thinking is. He did tweet recently that he had applied for graduation, which I think probably means he can graduate at the end of the summer. Mm-hmm. So that would open up the opportunity of a graduate transfer if that all plays correctly to where he could go play immediately somewhere else. My money, though, is on him being here in the fall because we still don't know he's going to be healthy. And if that's a question, to me it makes the most sense to be at Kentucky, watch from the sideline, do whatever. If Steven gets hurt, then you're available to come in, spend that year getting completely healthy, and then hope to go for it again and have another year to start as a senior.
Yeah, I mean, Barker was a slam dunk recruit and a great get, and his development into being the starter was the track that Mark Stoops needed. But Steven Johnson just had something about him, just had the it factor. Once the games got going and he got comfortable and took over that role, it was a tremendous story. And one of those things where you can't necessarily always put your finger on it, but you just know he's got it. If he can improve his ball, if he can not turn the ball over, and from the standpoint that you're usually worried about with a quarterback, which is interceptions, his was fumbles, and I guess he spent a lot of time in the offseason trying to improve that.
Yeah, the story he told last week a couple times is they have him walking around the weight room just carrying 45-pound plates in terms of like getting his grip strength stronger. We said earlier that he's eating close to 5,000 calories a day to just gain weight and get stronger throughout his body. I think that's a huge thing, but from when I talked to Mark Stoops for the pre-spring football episode of the podcast that you can still go back and listen to, he said it then. Eddie Grant said it the second day of practice, and we've heard it multiple times from Steven and Grant and Darren Henshaw since then. Focus number 1, number 2, and number 3 for Steven Johnson is fixing the turnover issue.
Right.
And if he can do that and play the way, maybe not even to the extent he did against Louisville, but approach that level of play he had in that season finale, he's a really good quarterback, a college quarterback at that point. And with everything else that they're returning on offense, you got to feel comfortable in the run game with Benny Snell back and a couple of young guys there and Saheem King and A.J. Rose behind them. They've got a bunch of veteran receivers, got a couple, 2, 3 tight ends now they seem pretty confident in. The offensive line is a major strength for this team. So if you have quarterback and quarterback's not a question, this could be a really special offense for Kentucky this year. Defensively, there are still a ton of question marks, but if Steven Johnson fixes the turnover issue, I think offensively it's kind of watch out for this team.
And that's why I ask about the situation sometimes. What's the feel of this if you've got a guy breathing down your neck for your job? Because I thought while he is a smaller guy in terms of SEC, and maybe he needs to work on his grip strength, I thought some of his fumbles came from trying to do too much or holding on to the ball too long. So I think if he has the job, he's settled and he understands that it's okay to punt or it's okay to kick the field goal or it's okay to throw it out of bounds and have a third down instead of trying to hold on to the ball a little bit longer. I think that cause or fix some of the issue too.
Yeah, and he's got I think with experience it will help in terms of understanding those situations a little bit more because he's said this before that just naturally his kind of inclination is to play like a running quarterback who's much bigger, like a Ben Roethlisberger or somebody out there who to invite contact and go after guys. And clearly that's not a great situation at his frame. We saw some of those fumbles, like you mentioned, where he was trying to extend plays. And in hindsight and with experience, it's clearly the better decision just to go down and live to fight another play. And I think we'll see that more of that this year now that he understands the situation he's in.
Certainly, yeah. But his rise to the starting job is pretty incredible, really. So
now, quarterback obviously is always going to get the most attention in spring football. With Barker coming back, it only adds to that this year. But I think everybody around the team and observing the team, and I try and put this in every story I write about Drew Barker, the quarterback situation, it's clear that Steven Johnson is the starter. It's not a true quarterback controversy until Drew Barker gets 100% healthy and proves that he's capable of winning games again. So that being said, the actual legitimate kind of position battles for this team this spring, I think, are mostly all on defense. The defensive line is a huge question mark. In that podcast from about a month ago, Mark Stoops basically said that he hoped He did not fire Jimmy Brumbaugh. Brumbaugh left for what appears to be a better job as the co-defensive coordinator at Maryland. But Mark hired Derek LeBlanc as the replacement. But Mark told me, and has basically said it a couple other times since then, that he really hopes that getting a different voice in that defensive line room really leads to some improvement from those guys, because that was the position when they went back over at the end of the season and broke down all the film, evaluating themselves, where it was clear they did not live up to the standard that Stoops had for that defense. And guys like Matt Elam, a 5-star recruit according to one service, is now a senior and has not really done anything of note in his career. Adrian Middleton, who's a returning starter, is going to be a junior this fall. Those guys really need to step up and make major improvements. They got a bunch of young guys on the defensive line who are going to have to play this year, but you can't expect freshmen and redshirt freshmen to come out and lead the way there. So those veterans are going to have to play much better than they have so far. And this spring, we're getting decent reports from them. We talked to Nick Haynes, one of the offensive linemen, the other day, and he said he thinks the defensive line has been much better just going against those guys in practice and maybe responding to the new coach at that position. But until we get in the fall, it's going to be significantly a worry for this team. And I'm interested to see it next week in the spring game, but that's a kind of controlled atmosphere, and the quarterbacks obviously aren't live, so I don't think we'll be able to tell much from that. But if Kentucky's going to have a truly special season this year, they've got to get much better defensive line play.
Right, and in this conference, and usually in football just in general, it's can you protect your quarterback, which Kentucky has put itself in a great position on the offensive line. And it's, can you get to the quarterback? Can you create these kind of turnovers that we saw from Steven Johnson? And I think that if you don't have a good defensive line, you're putting yourself at a disadvantage because you got to find a way to manufacture pressure. You got to bring more guys. I do like your point. Maybe having a different voice, maybe a new coach. Everybody's on a clean slate, which means everybody's got to work as hard or prove themselves as much in spring. But I don't know. Do you see any of these young guys stepping up? They've got some experience, like you said, but maybe some of that experience is not necessarily, stuff to write home about.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, I think at this point with several of those guys who are upperclassmen, that I think in much the same way that we said this about Derek Willis throughout the season, like we know what those guys are now. We know what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are. I don't think you can expect them to change drastically as players over the course of a year. So I think Mark Stoops and Matt House, the new defensive coordinator, and Derek LeBlanc, the new defensive line coach, would be very happy to see whether it's T.J. Carter, who I know you wrote about during the season last year, Jaquiz Cross, Cordell Looney, who both redshirted on the line, or these guys they're bringing in the 17 class in the summer, Chris Whitaker, Josh Pascal, the list goes on and on. Some of those guys to come in and just with their natural talent to earn a spot in this rotation and push some of those older guys to the side. Because at this point for me, you know what those old guys are. If you've got a young guy who can make plays, and you might take some of the mistakes that come along with it in hopes that you're going to get some more tackles for loss, more sacks, which we saw very few of those from the line at all last year.
I'll give those veterans some credit. They've got a higher floor, but I think Kentucky needs a younger kid with a higher ceiling to kind of emerge.
The other little bit of roster news from football this week. Outside of the defensive line, I think we're pretty understanding what Kentucky has in the second and third levels of the defense. They've got some position battles there, but the candidates are pretty well known. Special teams wise, punter was maybe the weakest position on the roster last year. Outside of defensive line, regardless, that's the battle between the two. Grant McInnes is going to be a sophomore. They need him to get much better. They are bringing in a graduate transfer, going out against the John Calipari philosophy. Matthew Panton from Columbia. He's an Aussie-style punter from Australia, who was a short yardage kind of situational guy at Columbia, but actually averaged more yards per punt than McInnes did last year. He would be here in the summer. I would expect him to push for the job. I wrote about this week. You can still find the story on Courier-Journal.com about just kind of the pressure on the punting situation. And the new special teams coordinator, Dean Hood, told me, he said this at his introductory press conference, that what he understood from Grant McInnes' struggles were most of it was mental. It was a situation where he was punting well in practice, and then for whatever reason it didn't translate to game. So when I asked him for an update the other day, he said, frankly, I don't think we're going to know until we see him out there in the game because practice has never been the issue before. So I think that's still a question mark for Kentucky going into the year, and maybe this graduate transfer is the answer in terms of pushing McInnes and also offering a realistic possibility if he continues to struggle.
I wanted to ask you about special teams and Coach Hood coming in, because if we're contemplating hypotheticals where Kentucky, if they could pull off a win with Florida or Tennessee coming to Commonwealth Stadium, if they could pick themselves into a fight where maybe going to Georgia near the end of the season, they've got themselves in a good position in the East to be competing. I think special teams are kind of what can make a difference once you've solidified yourself with a decent enough talent base. So, I mean, do you see them being able to not just sort of hold serve on special teams like maybe they've been trying to do in the past? Can they actually use those units as an impact?
I think maybe. They've said all the right things this spring in terms of expecting them to be a little more aggressive. Both Hood and Mark Stoops have said some things that suggest maybe they're going to be take some more risks, get some return guys in there. I think they're going to have the type of athletes on campus this fall that maybe you would hope to get in the return game and get the ball in their hands. It's all about Lynn Bowden, both on offense and return game. I mean, that's a kid who is a freshman. I think everybody is already penciling in as to be one of their most dynamic playmakers and maybe replace some of that big play capability you lose in Boone Williams and Jeff Badette both leaving early. And so punt return, kick return is another area where you could put the ball in his hands and see what he can do out there. So I would expect him to be more aggressive there. This spring, Dean Hood said the other day, basically most of the focus has been on the punt team because schematically that's where you can get the most work, whereas the other units are mostly drill work and getting fundamentals down. So I don't think we'll see a ton of that in the spring game in a couple of weeks, but I am pleasantly optimistic that they might be a little more aggressive and find some more exciting plays on special teams heading into the fall.
Am I right, though, that they've been basically just hoping to hold serve on special teams?
Yeah, I think Mark Stoops, since he's gotten here, has basically been a guy who's almost solely concerned with keeping the ball at the end of returns. He gets really upset, obviously, when they fumble, as every coach does when they muff a punt. But he's basically not going to be – he's never been a coach since he's been at Kentucky who is willing to risk things on special teams at the risk of putting his defense in a worse spot. I think everything he knew that he was very limited personnel-wise on defense for most of the time he's been here, so he wanted to help that unit out as much as possible. And so as he gets more comfortable with that side of the ball and letting his defense do some more things, I think that opens the door for some more risk on special teams for sure.
Yeah, do you get the feeling, though, that, I mean, we've talked about it now. You're playing. I like to play the hypothetical game, and if they could pick off one of Tennessee and Florida at home, you get the feeling that maybe they've distanced themselves from South Carolina, Vandy. Yeah. I think Missouri, it's hard to read what's ever going on over there, but if they could pull away from that group and then maybe get a win against Tennessee, Florida, or Georgia, I mean, they're on their way.
Yeah, I think this is the year. I've always kind of been of the thought that the ceiling for Kentucky football, until something drastic happens, is to get back to where Rich Brooks was, where you win 7-8 games every season. You're always going to one of those mid-tier SEC bowls. And then every 3 or 4 years, when you have a really strong veteran group, hope to go out and make a run where you can win 9, 10, 11 games once, every 4 or 5 years. And obviously Brooks fell short of that goal when he had guys like Jacob Tammy and Andre Woodson and Braxton Kelly and Wesley Woodyard and all those guys on the team. They never took that next step. If Kentucky is going to take that step under Mark Stoops, I think this is the year they probably do it. And obviously he's got a big contract extension just recently that supports that. If they win 9 games, he gets 2 years automatically. So added to his contract. We'll see that. We're nearing the end of the podcast. Just before we go there, a quick word on UK baseball. I think 0-4 start, replacing their entire weekend rotation. We had pretty much written them off for dead at the beginning of the season. We've both been very impressed with Nick Mingione, the new baseball coach, and what he's done in terms of just adding momentum off the field. But it looked like it was going to be a rebuilding year, and since then they have just been amazing. Are now in first place in the SEC East. They're 7-2 in Southeastern Conference play. Top 10 matchup against Louisville on Tuesday, the day after recording this. But from all indications, we're going to have to be paying a lot more attention to baseball over the next month than we thought we were going to.
Right. You start getting series wins against Vanderbilt, and who knew? I moved up here and got 2 top 10 teams here in the Commonwealth, Louisville and Kentucky. It's been great, and I think obviously in the first year, coaching change, new stadium is coming, and they're already performing at a higher level than expected. So things are going really well right now. Yeah,
I've got a story online today on Courier-Journal.com on Monday. It'll be in print on Tuesday, previewing the Louisville game about their new pitching coach, Jim Bellinger, who is a former U of L pitcher, pitched in the College World Series for Louisville in 2007. and has now been kind of at the front of this, answering all these pitching questions Kentucky had going into the year, and that's really turned into something of a strength for this team. So I encourage you to check that out. We'll be back next week on Monday. We're going to try and do this regularly on Monday throughout the summer. We might chime in with an extra episode here or there if something happens. But until Monday, make sure you're following Fletcher at Fletcher Page on Twitter. I'm at JohnHale_CJ. Check out Courier-Journal for all our work, and like the CatsHQ page on Facebook. But until then, thanks for listening.